Hi everybody, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you this evening. A few years ago, Christina and I were lucky enough to get permission to start working with and at the Wiltshire Museum. The Wiltshire Museum has a mind-blowing collection of many of the very coolest things about the two periods of the British and Irish past that I particularly love, the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. And Lisa, the wonderful curator, and David, who you've met, both made us really welcome, and their generosity and general helpfulness have enabled us to conduct some amazing research that we're really very proud of. So it's a huge pleasure to return some of the many favors that they have done for us by being here with you this evening as a small token of our very hefty gratitude towards the Wiltshire Museum. So how was it that we came to be in the Wiltshire Museum? Myself and Dr. Ollie Harris, also from the University of Leicester, secured funding from the Leverhulme Trust for a research project called Beyond the Three-Age System. The three-age system is the term we use for the way that archaeologists classically divide up what we might term prehistory into the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. This division shapes the way that archaeologists approach the study of these different periods. It's really common and perhaps unsurprising that many stone tool specialists are often specialists in the Stone Ages, and that metalwork specialists are often Bronze Age specialists. And I'm a case in point here. My specialism is in the study of metalwork and indeed the Bronze and Neolithic periods. The three-age system, though, doesn't simply order the data that we have. It often ends up structuring the stories that we tell about the past, and it generates real divides between practitioners, serving to separate those who study flint and stone from those who might study bronze or iron. So the way in which the framework of the three-age system shapes our data is at the core of this project that we've been running out of the University of Leicester. It's aimed to challenge the divides that we traditionally draw between the different periods and the roles that we give to the materials within them. At the heart of our project lie two materials that underpin the changes between the Stone Age through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. That is stone and metal. So we've undertaken empirical study of what these materials were used for through wear analysis from the late Neolithic through to the early Iron Age. And the effects of COVID on our project, that came kind of bang smack in the middle of the time we were supposed to be doing our analysis, means that much of what we've focused on is the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. And that's part of the story that we'll be telling tonight. And the aim of our project was to think about change through time without predetermining what the role of stone or bronze was going to be in these different periods, and to try and think past and through and between the boundaries between periods. So historically, archaeologists have written about the role of the materials stone and bronze in some quite particular ways. In studies of the Neolithic, there are two competing understandings of stone. Sometimes it's seen as the era's principal functional product, both because it's the material that we find most often and because of its link to the identity of the period. Sometimes our approaches focus on particular forms of flint and particular other kinds of stones as kind of magical and special materials. So we might look at the amazing ways that flint was mined at places like Grimes Grave, or stone was extracted at Langdale in the Lake District, and the way that the objects from these particular kinds of places were shaped into particularly fantastical forms like polished knives and axes. But when we move into the Bronze Age, people approach stone in a really different way. The standard assumption is that stone tools effectively declined in importance when bronze became widespread. And this is held to be the case despite the fact that on Bronze Age sites we find quite a lot of stone tools, really. And it contradicts the development from the early Bronze Age, where the changes and development of metalworking technology sit alongside the production of increasingly elaborate flint artifacts, especially kind of over-engineered forms like flint daggers. And as this project's revealed, one thing that's really interesting about this transition to metalworking is that it has a really important stone element, that stone tools were really central in extracting, making, and maintaining the metal tools that people developed. And then if we think about how people traditionally think about metals, so metal emerges in Britain first as copper and later then as bronze, where we've got copper and tin alloyed together. And it's understood quite differently than stone. It's not seen in those kind of brute functional terms. Some interpretations treat it as an almost magical material, and often it's treated as a form of wealth finance. So the idea that people who had access to metals perhaps became powerful chiefs or leaders, and that this might have spurred an increase in violence in the period as well. And it leads to this idea of our Machiavellian chief gaining access to his bronze and becoming a leader and taking part in trading and perhaps also in violence. We argue that all of these kind of assumptions about the role of metals and stone in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age are underpinned with a really particular view that presumes that metals are superior technologically and that they necessarily replace stone, and assumes that stone is the main thing you should be looking at in the Neolithic period and metal is the main focus in the Bronze Age. So it's a really interesting kind of background into which we insert this. And our project, Beyond the Three Age System, combines archaeological theory alongside microware analysis to disrupt the kind of traditional model that I've talked about. Microware analysis is the study of the surface of objects to gain information about how they were made, used, maintained, and discarded. The process is non-destructive, so in the scheme of archaeological science interventions, it's easier to get permission for than something like aDNA analysis, where you need to destroy a sample in the process. And it uses both high and low power microscopes to look at the surfaces of the objects, identify the traces that have been left behind, and look for things like polishes on them. We understand the traces that we see through the microscope by comparing them to known experimental reference collections. So Christina, for example, who is an expert in stoneware analysis in particular, has spent lots of time looking at lots of tools that have been used in controlled experiments, so that the difference between a stone tool that's been used on hide or one that's been used on wood or bone is something that she's familiar with and can work out. And Christina, who you'll hear from a bit later in the paper, is our expert microware analysis on this project. She carried out all of the amazing work that you're going to hear about this evening. And in the course of Christina working away in the Wiltshire Museum, we found that all of a sudden we needed an expert in early Bronze Age gold working. Now, this was not something that we had expected, not something that we thought the project would focus on. But Christina messaged us and said, I think I can see some gold traces on some things, but I don't know, maybe I'm imagining it. It's just, I wasn't thinking I would see them. What should we do? And Christina got in touch with Chris Standish from the University of Southampton. And Chris is an amazing specialist in early Bronze Age gold working. He does lots of stuff on understanding its composition, on how we can tell early Bronze Age gold from other periods, and how we can work out where it's come from. And so, as Christina had found what she thought might be gold, we got in touch with Chris, and we worked with Chris and his colleague Richard Pearce from the University of Southampton, and also our SEM specialist at Leicester, somebody called Sarah Morris. So whilst you've just got me and Christina today, behind us in the background, you've got Hugh and Ollie, who you can see in the image on the slide, and Chris, Richard, and Sarah. It's a big team effort, this project. So with all of this kind of background about what the project was and why we were doing it in mind, let's travel to the early Bronze Age in Britain. So about 4,000 years ago, two bodies were sequentially laid to rest under an earthen barrow. Today, we call that barrow, Upton Lovell G2A, and sometimes it's called the Shaman burial. And the burial has become a really famous part of archaeologists' understandings of the early Bronze Age in southern Britain. There are currently no radiocarbon dates that are published associated with the burial, but by comparing the grave goods that were found in it with others that we know the dates of, we can suggest that this burial dates to between 1850 and 1700 Cal BC. So Upton Lovell, G2A, was a low 10-metre round mound, upstanding to a height of about 30 centimetres when it was excavated in 1801 by the famous antiquarian William Cunnington. The probable primary inhumation was found at the base of a grave that was cut into the chalk. This person was lying on their back, about a metre below the mound's surface. And a second individual was found above this first person. And in the kind of description of Cunnington's excavation at the site, the person is described as being in a sitting posture. So some people will have argued that the person was literally sat upright in the grave, and there are other graves where we find this in Britain. And other people have interpreted this, particularly Stuart Piggott has argued that what the description means is that the second body was in a crouched inhumation. So lying on their side with their hands probably near their chest and their knees tucked into them in a kind of a crouched up small position. So we've got a primary burial at the top and a secondary one, either crouched on its side or in a sitting posture on top of them. The primary burial is often described as male, and the secondary burial is often talked about as female. But there isn't a currently published osteological assessment for these skeletons. So Cunnington argued that the primary burial was that of a man. But one of the things we have to think about a little bit when we consider this burial is that at the time it was quite common to associate primary burials with men. And in particular, burials that were associated with large numbers of grave goods are often also associated with men, and secondary burials were often identified as female. Now, Cunnington was an excellent archaeologist in a great many ways, and maybe he's right, maybe one was male and one was female, but because there isn't a modern osteological assessment, and because we know that archaeologists have been revisiting lots of these kind of older sexings of skeletons and finding when they apply modern techniques that they don't stand up, we choose not in our research to talk about the male and the female characters. So the burial contained a really large number of grave goods, but there aren't any plans from the burial at the time it was excavated, so we can't tell you precisely what it all looked like in the way that you would with a modern excavation. But there is a written description that's associated with it, and some of the items that were found in a grave are really clearly associated with the primary burial in the description. It talks about some objects being near the feet and some near the chest. And for some of the other objects, you can't tell in the description that's been published whether they were associated with the primary burial or the secondary burial. So the grave goods that were associated with the primary burial include over 40 perforated bone points. Of these, most of them were found close to the feet of the primary burial, and about 12 of them were found near to the chest. So this kind of collection of perforated bone points, some at the feet and some at the chest. On top of that, we had some what get called stone rubbers. They're basically stone cobbles that were found near the feet, as well as a grooved abrader, a copper alloy awl, 2 halves of a broken battle axe, 4 polished flint axes, 3 of which were complete. Further up the body and close to the legs were 3 perforated boar's tusks and 4 flint nodule cups. And by the chest of the primary burial was a complete battle axe. In addition, other grave goods that aren't clearly associated with a body part or a burial include 3 jet beads, a bone bead, and a jet belt ring. And it's hard to work out where they were. So it's a really rich collection of quite varied grave goods of a collection of different things. So the assemblage of bodies, stone tools, battle axes, and elaborate costume, they're kind of all of these bits have been interpreted as a kind of an elaborate costume that was associated with the primary burial. And this means that the burial has attracted a wide range of interpretations. From the outset in the literature, the emphasis is always on the primary burial and who this person was. And archaeologists have spent a lot of time debating whether the person buried at Upton Lovell G2A was perhaps a shaman, a metal worker, or maybe a gold worker. So the shaman part of this comes from this collection of perforated bone points, a number of them found around the feet and some around the chest. And these have been interpreted as making up a costume. And that costume compares a bit to what you can see on the screen here. The image on the right is the Bard Thurumberg Mesolithic shaman burial. And this kind of outfit of teeth and animal points has been suggested to have perhaps been quite like what was at Upton Lovell. It's quite different, actually. There's a lot of teeth in this one and not so many teeth in the Upton Lovell burial. But this idea of kind of all of these bone points being part of an elaborate costume of kind of animal parts that might have been associated with a shaman. So Pigott was the first person to make this kind of shaman suggestion. He suggested that the bone points and the boar's tusks were part of a shaman's costume. And he was comparing it to the kind of Mesolithic burials like the one I've illustrated on the screen, and burials from Russia in particular, where individuals interred in these kind of outfits are often presented as shamans. And he argued that the person in the burial must have been of quite high status. So the inclusion of the battle axe, which is a stone axe with a hole drilled through the center of it, in the burial is suggested to have indicated that this person was of high status and perhaps great wealth. And it becomes known from this point onwards, and following Stuart Pigott's work, as the shaman burial because of this, but also because there's a second very famous barrow from Upton Level. Lucky people who live in Upton Level in the audience. And that barrow is full of kind of gold, and it gets referred to as the golden barrow to contrast it with this one, which is often referred to as the shaman burial. In the 1970s, Pigott wrote a little bit more about this shaman idea, and he went on to compare some of the stone tools that were found in the grave with metalworking tools that are known from continental Europe. And he argued that the person might have been a shaman and a metalworker. And then much later, in the year 2000, Colin Shell highlighted a kind of a bit of forgotten text from the 1870s from the antiquarium Thurnham that identified gold traces on one stone tool. And Shell used some non-destructive semi-quantitative X-ray fluorescence analysis on the gold traces on this one tool to show that the elemental makeup of the gold traces that he could see was similar to that known from other early Bronze Age gold. And he concluded that the individual buried in Upton Level might be a shaman, a metal worker, a gold worker, or maybe all three of those labels applied to this person. To date, what's happened really is that the grave goods in this grave have had this really key role in defining the identity of one of the individuals buried at Upton Level. The second burial always seems to get forgotten. And the materials have been interpreted as symbolic of that individual's identity. And given that we can't be certain precisely which objects were associated with which body, that's a bit awkward and complicated for us archaeologically. So we tried to do something different in our analysis. We brought our attention not to what the person wore, but what the objects in that grave had been used for, and thinking about them as tools and how that might change our understanding of the burial. Our research focused less on who the individual buried at the site was and more on what they'd done by studying how the grave goods they'd been buried with had been used and made. So we used microwire analysis to study the stone and metal grave goods from the grave. Sometimes you'll see microwire analysis referred to as useware. It's the same thing. It's a really well-established analytical technique that studies these small traces left on the surface of objects. And our analysis expanded on some earlier work that had been done using low-power microscopy on some of the objects from this grave. And by using high-power microscopic analyses, we were able to reveal new things about the stone and flint objects from in the grave and the copper alloy ore. And in our work, we focus on trying to use the traces that we can see to think about how people were using these objects in terms of contact materials, but also in terms of the way they're moving and the gestures that they're making with them. And we thought about how the different objects in the grave might have been used together. So not thinking about this object is an awl or a grinder, but what can you do when you use all these objects together, and how does that change our understanding? The microwire analysis was used to identify some key areas on the tools that we then targeted for non-destructive compositional analysis using SEM EDS to detect particular elements. So basically, Christina found some stuff she thought might be gold, and we got Chris Standish to come in and use the SEM to identify whether those traces really were gold, and to tell us whether that gold was accidentally put there by the ring of a curator 200 years ago, well, 100 years ago, or whether it was really early Bronze Age gold. There's a compositional difference in the kind of small elemental traces that allow us to separate out Bronze Age gold from modern gold. And that was what the role of the SEM EDS work was. So what have our analysis revealed? At this point, I'm going to hand over to Christina, who is the real expert and the star of every show. And I'm going to get her to talk through the different kinds of traces that she identified and what they can tell us about the grave. And then we'll come back to me towards the end. There's going to be a little touch of the next slide here, please, for this section of the talk. So I will be Christina's humble assistant. Take it away.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everyone. So in the next few slides, I would like to present an overview of the results of our analysis and discuss how this has helped us understand the function of the objects that were placed in the burial. So within the assemblage, there is a group of stone tools that have been previously collectively described as stone rubbers or polishers. These tools, however, and as you can see on the slide for yourselves, saw variation in their size, morphology, and surface treatment that ranges from naturally water-worn surfaces to intentionally polished ones, and therefore the tools can be associated with different processes and actions. And based on the microwear traces and the metal residues that were found on the surface of these objects, and as Rachel has already mentioned, they are consistent with early Bronze Age gold alloys, we interpreted these tools as tools used for the plastic shaping and the planishing of metals using hammering actions, either used as handheld hammers or as lower stationary anvils. Now, the percussive tools show variation in the surface texture of their use faces. Some are smoothed, while others have a blunt, roughened use face. These tools could have been used in order to create different textured surfaces on gold objects, potentially as some form of decoration. Within the grave assemblage, there are also two polished objects made from greenstone of Cornish origin, and you can see these objects here on the slide. Both objects were used in a percussive action to work metal. While this functioned as part of the same processes as the previous set of tools, the distinctive shape and material reveals divergent histories to the water-old set of tools I described in the previous slide. Indeed, these seem to have been once fragments of battle axes intentionally reworked into metal working tools. Interestingly, gold traces that were found on one of these repurposed battle axe fragments are compositionally similar with the gold residues that were found on one of the smoothed cobbles that was used as an anvil. And this may suggest that these two objects were actually used together to work the same gold object. Apart from these heavily reworked battle axe fragments, the burial also contained another two battle axes, a complete one, as you can see on the left of the slide, and one that was broken in two pieces. Now, while battle axes are traditionally seen as symbols of prestige and male power, and they are associated with combat and warfare, a close reading of the traces on the surface of the battle axes from Upton Lovell offered rather unexpected results and opens up different possibilities about the way they might have been used in the past. So at some point in their history, both the complete and the two battle axe fragments were used as hammers for goldworking, but to a different extent. The two battle axe fragments once formed part of the same object. In its original form, the battle axe was used to chop bone, but following its breakage in half, it was heavily reworked, and then both fragments were used as handheld hammers, possibly for goldworking activities, as traces of gold-colored reflective residue on the cutting edge of the object suggests. The memory of the once complete battle axe in its previous form seems to have persisted, as both fragments were subsequently placed by the feet of the deceased at the time of the burial. In the case of the complete battle axe, different gold traces of distinct composition were found on its surface, suggesting that the battle axe was used for working different gold alloys and had experienced multiple phases of use as a gold working tool before it was placed in the burial. Interestingly, the composition of the gold alloy traces that were found on the complete battle axe are consistent with the traces that were identified on a polishing tool that was also placed in the burial, suggesting once again that both these objects have been used together in the manufacture of the same gold artifact. The microwear traces on the slate tool are consistent with the use of the object in an abrasive motion, and therefore the tool can be associated with the polishing and the final finishing stage of gold objects. Polishing tools could have also been used to correct errors made during the decoration of golden objects by polishing away inaccurately executed decorative motifs. While some gold traces were previously identified on the surface of this tool by Thurman and Shell, as Rachel mentioned, our analysis has identified further gold traces with different compositions, suggesting that the tool was used in the manufacture of multiple gold objects. But we also found copper residues on this tool, and this suggests that the tool was actually had a dual function, so it was used to work both gold and copper alloy object in prehistory. Buttrill previously interpreted this object as a touchstone that was used to assess the quality of gold. Indeed, touchstones tend to be made of black-colored and fine-grained rocks such as tuffs, cherts, and siltstones. But in the case of the Upton Lovell G2A example, the location of the gold residues on both the broad surfaces, but also on the narrow sides and ridges, and the intentional shaping of all surfaces of the object suggests that this has been used for polishing narrow gold surfaces instead. Now, the burial, apart from the stone objects we presented, also contained a copper alloy awl, and the wear traces on the tip of the awl suggest use with compressive force against the material of medium hardness, and not as a use against a soft material such as human flesh. So a previous interpretation that this awl may have been used as part of a toolkit for tattooing and bodily scarification does not really, is not consistent with the wear traces we see on the tip of this awl. I have to say, we haven't found gold traces. We have examined this all with the SEM. We haven't found any gold traces on the surface, but there's still a way possible. It is very possible that the tool was used as part of a gold working tool, as part of the gold working toolkit as well. Now, through our analysis, we also identified a pigment processing toolkit that consisted of an interesting collection of materials. A lower abrading slab that was used to pulverize ochre, a Neolithic flint axe that was reused to crush hematite, and 4 flint nodule caps. The flint nodule caps show signs of light abrasive wear in the hollows, and 3 display red to brown colored residues. The wear traces indicate the use of these objects for light mixing. And ochre can be used as an additive when making compound adhesives, or it may have been also used as a polishing agent. And this is a practice we encounter in modern jewelry as well. One of the most interesting discoveries of our analysis, however, was the identification of gold traces on the cutting edge of one of the Neolithic flint axes. The use of the flint axe as a gold working tool is not immediately obvious. The axe retains its original polished and smooth surface. There is no evidence to suggest that the cutting edge was reused in some form, either to crush or work gold using a percussive motion. One possibility is that the axe was used to smoothen a gold object using the original beveled surface of the cutting edge. Having said that, there are no wear traces to suggest that the axe was used extensively in this kind of secondary abrasive activity. But we would expect if it has been used in that way, the original polished surface would have been affected. Another possibility to consider is whether gold was intentionally applied to the surface of the axe for decorative purposes instead. So it's a way to decorate this Neolithic flint axe using applying a layer of gold on the surface. Now, where there is strong evidence for gold working activities, the working of copper alloys is also evidenced in the burial assemblage. Now, apart from the polishing tool I already mentioned in my previous slide, traces of copper alloys were found on other stone objects in the assemblage, including this stone tool in the middle that was used as an anvil, and also this grooved braider. Grooved abraders have traditionally been interpreted as arrow shaft straighteners and have been associated with hunting toolkits. In the case of the Upton Lovell assemblage, the results of the microware analysis show that while the grooved abrader it was used to smooth and shape wooden implements, the tool also had a metal working function, and it was used to shape metal objects employing a linear abrading motion. And now I'm not going to hand over to Rachel, who will discuss the wider implications of our analysis and how this improves our understanding of gold working in the early Bronze Age period.
So one of the first things to bear in mind is that we never went into this project thinking that we were going to be busy finding gold working, and that we very quickly had to increase our knowledge and skill area in this kind of material. I'm a metal specialist, but I mostly work with copper and bronze and hadn't done any work on gold previously. But there is an amazing gold working tradition in the early Bronze Age. It's when gold first emerges as a material that people are interested in making things with and using in new ways. So what kind of gold work do we think these tools from Upton Level were used on? We think that they're best understood in relation to what gets called the sheet gold cover tradition. And this is an early Bronze Age crafting practice where intricate designs are applied to sheets, very thin sheets of gold. And that gold is then usually shaped around a core object in another material. So that core object might be made of something like jet, shale, amber, wood, or copper, with the thin layer of gold applied on the outside of it. You can see one example here. We've got a jet cone, and the cone, hopefully you can see where my mouse is decorated in the same way as the external cover that's applied to the object that's in this very fine gold work with the incised decoration on it. And for those of you who are in the Wiltshire area, you're very lucky in that loads of amazing sheet gold cover work is on display at the Wiltshire Museum. So if I hadn't already convinced you that you want to go and check out the Shaman burial again, then you should also go and check out the amazing gold work that it was probably a part of. And the technology involved in sheet gold cover working is a really multi-material practice, because the end product is always this kind of composite object that's gold, a core of another material, and probably adhesives that were involved. And it requires a toolkit that contains lots of different other materials, stone and perhaps copper as well, as we've seen in the kind of discussion that we've given today. So none of the tools that were found in the Upton Lovell assemblage point towards necessarily smelting gold. Instead, what they're evidencing is the process of taking gold, working it into a really thin sheet, embellishing it with decoration, and then applying it to another object. So the assemblage provides us with some evidence that suggests that perhaps gold working was a multi-phase craft process at this time, and maybe even at different parts of the process were perhaps being carried out by different people. And there are similar arguments beginning to emerge for different kinds of assemblages that have been found in continental Europe that date around the same time. An analysis of the sheet gold cover objects themselves has also suggested that perhaps there are two-stage or two or more stage production process for them. So in the kind of evidence that Christina's discussed, we've got direct evidence from the percussive tools for the technique of hammering our metal to produce smooth, flat surfaces. And as Christina's shown, there are grave goods that have been used as anvils, so they're stationary, and ones that have been used as hammers, so that they're moving in order to create these flat surfaces. And these percussive tools, when we look at them, you can see a collection of them on the screen here, are from really different lithologies. They're different rock types. Their surfaces have been really carefully prepared and maintained to allow them to function as effective tools. We've also got really good evidence that smoothing and polishing was a key process that the grave goods were involved in as well. and polishing that sheet gold once you've beaten it out thin. Polishing it to get a really kind of fine, shiny finish on it would have been a really important process, and allowing, as Christina's already outlined, the erasure of any small mistakes. In terms of the really fine decoration that's on these gold objects, existing research has kind of, in some ways, it's suggested a lot of possibilities for how this was executed, but we've never had amazing evidence for how it was done. So the suggestion is that a range of slightly blunted, so that they're going to incise in but not cut through the gold, slightly blunted items were used for this decoration, and that they might have been made of wood, bone, or flint, for example. And so the expert in gold work, somebody called Joan Taylor, suggested a while ago that wooden styluses might have been used for this incised decoration. And we've wondered about whether our grooved abrader that you could see here on the screen, something that's making wooden points, could have been key in the production of wooden points in order to do the kind of incising that we've got. And to maintain those wooden styluses as well. So we've got our smooth, shiny, flat gold, and we've got some decoration on it. The next kind of step in this process is to think about joining our sheet object to our core object. And it's possible that the evidence for ochre and adhesives that we've got in these little flint nodule cups, and in the slab that's been used for processing ochre, and the axe that has evidence of hematite on it, might well have been used in the production of adhesives to join the two parts of these objects together. There's long been a suggestion that adhesives have been involved in this, and this is a really interesting kind of a smoking gun, if you like, for what might have been done. So we don't have direct evidence for resin in the grave assemblage, but we've got this kind of hint at the production of ochres and adhesives that could have been part of this process as well. One of the things that's really interesting here is that gold is this star material when we talk about the early Bronze Age. It grabs our attention, and it's written about as being valuable and prestigious. If you were lucky enough to go to the British Museum's exhibition on the time of Stonehenge, there were amazing gold objects on show there, but Wiltshire Museum has its own golden wonders too. And part of the star quality and the narrative of the Bronze Age that gold has is part of its role as one of the earliest metals, and the heady mix of gold's association with status, its novelty as a new metal at the time, mean that it's often written about in really different ways than other materials. We talk about valuing it differently, working it differently, and we mark those who had access to it as different kinds of people. So in our Upton Lovell G2A burial, gold is an absent present. There aren't gold grave goods. There are perforated bone points and stone tools in here. There are tiny analysis has been able to reveal. But the gold working toolkit in this burial was dominated by stone tools. It's not a toolkit for smelting, but it's a toolkit for working a solid, semi-hard material. And in many ways, we can think about this as an assemblage for working a material that shared a lot of properties with stone, worked through percussive and polishing processes. And it's a toolkit that relies on being able to work stone. If you want to be able to use these amazing stone tools to work your gold sheet, you've got to be able to look after them, keep their surfaces correct, and maintain them properly. Our percussive and debrasive and polishing tools all require their own kind of gold, their own kind of maintenance processes. One of the interesting things when we talk about the kind of different lithologies that are in here, all of these different rocks that have different colors to them, different textures to their rocky makeup. We've got kind of smooth rock, and we've got more sandstony, gritty, bumpy rocks in here as well. So they've been really carefully collected by whoever's brought them together, presumably the two people in the grave. They've gone and they've collected specific rocks for specific purposes with their beautiful colours and their different kinds of functions. These are people who knew how to work stone. They knew how it behaved and how it needed to be maintained. And on top of that, there are some really interesting histories in these stone objects too. Christina's already talked about this battle axe that's been used for other things and then is reused as a gold working tool. And it seems that the histories of these objects aren't arbitrary in this grave either. Taken as a set, for example, the battle axes appear to be in different stages of their use life, from the one that's still recognizable as a battle axe to the one that's in two parts brought back together at the feet of the primary burial, and then the two battle axes on the other, the two fragments of the same battle axe on the other side that are barely recognizable as ever having been battle axes at all. And the reuse of blunted axes as metalworking tools has been noted in other European contexts. So the repurposing of the Upton Lovell axes as percussive tools for metalworking tasks it's not a complete standout. We know that there are kind of parallels for this. The battle axes, though, weren't the only smooth stones that these people could have used for this process. They've clearly been selected and chosen for this. These, as a whole, this collection of rocks has all these different colours and textures to it, and it has these different histories and stories woven into it as well. These were not the only rocks that could have served this purpose. What is it about them being battle axes that led to them being selected for this? Did their histories rub off on the materials that they were working? And what's even more fascinating is we see a parallel in the flint axes as well. They have histories too. So the flint axes are probably much, much older than the burial itself. They probably date to the Neolithic period. They could be 4000 BC rather than the kind of 1800 that we're thinking of for the burial itself. And the four flint axes also have different degrees of reuse to them. So the one on the left is the most recognizably flint axe. And as you move towards the right, they're more heavily reused and less like their original form. In some cases, the cutting edge on these has been crushed, making them less recognizable. And we might speculate how maybe this parallels what's going on with the battle axes. And so in these objects selected to become tools, we've got kind of the past being really present here, stories about where these things have come from. And this kind of reuse of stone in metalworking processes, as I've said, is something that we have evidence from elsewhere. The other thing that's quite interesting here is that if we look at the stones as a whole, a number of them are water-worn cobbles. And we can think about how they have been smoothed and eroded by water themselves, and then they're being involved in this kind of smoothing and eroding process when they're working the gold. And one of the interesting speculations looked at this time is being extracted from waterborne river deposits. So if people are looking for gold, they're going to rivers probably to do that. That's kind of Chris, who's the real expert, Chris Standish, our gold expert's feeling is that lots of this gold was probably being extracted from rivers. Now we know that lots of flint axes from the Neolithic made their way into rivers, and we might wonder about whether splashing around in rivers looking for gold led people into contact with all these different rocks that became tools. I often think about the kind of hodgepodge way that all the tools in my garage have come together. Some were my granddad's, and some have come from my dad's, and some have come from my husband's dad, and all of these kind of tools that have been picked up from different places. And I have this image in my head of the people in the burial kind of being a bit like, oh, have you seen this rock? It'll be great for this job. A little bit of a hoarding tendency perhaps there too. And we might wonder whether those Neolithic flint axes had come out of rivers as well. So the grave goods from Upton Lovell form a really striking toolkit. Each stone in it has been shaped and marked by its past and present, the material that it's made of and its origins. And our analysis has allowed us to think in more detail about the specific nature of gold working at this time and how it drew on different kinds of material properties, histories, and gestures. Critically, one of the things the analysis suggests is that the same kinds of techniques that people had been using on stone for many years before were important too in the working of gold as it emerged as a new material and a new technology. And we might think about how similar to stone gold might have been, a mineral that you hammer and shape into its new form is not that dissimilar from some of the things that are going on with stone tools. So between them, these objects kind of reveal an intertwining set of processes, the way in which bodies and things come together in order to make these gold objects in the early Bronze Age. And for us, that kind of takes us somewhere beyond the simple labels of shaman, metalworker, or goldsmith. These grave goods weren't just about the representation of the deceased's identity. Instead, it talks about journeys between places, extracting rocks from different places, the colours of stone, the histories of it, and the textures of it. And they reveal the process of gold working to be one in which, of course, people were really central, but stone was really central too. It's not here that stone is a secondary material once you have metals. Instead, it's the key material in bringing those metals alive, in making that gold shiny and flat and decorating it as well. And we've thought about how all of these things can be kind of connected together to reveal that process, what archaeologists often refer to as a chain operatoire, the different steps that you need to take to make those gold cover items. And that's a really multi-material process. One of the things that I've liked most about this piece of work is I first remember seeing the shaman burial in the Wiltshire Museum when I was an undergraduate student in my first year of my degree. And that kind of story of a shaman buried in the early Bronze Age is a really fascinating one. And then kind of as I specialised more in the period, understanding that the shaman label was a bit kind of awkward. It's based on kind of seeing these objects as a costume. And instead, thinking about this burial with these grave goods as tools and what they've been used to do takes us in a different direction and lets us rethink this. And usually the question that we're asked at this point is, but what about the bone points? What are the bone points all about? And in one sense, we can think of them as part of that costume and what that kind of costume might have looked like. But we might also wonder whether those bone points might have been functional too. One of the things that future analysis can do is look at those bone points to see whether they too might have actually been used in gold working. Christina is not a boneware analyst expert, and neither am I, so it's not something either of us had the capability to do nor expected to do as part of this project. But a future piece of work considering whether the bone points are also perhaps part of a costume, but perhaps also functional in the processes of shaping and working gold, is something else that's a really interesting possibility. The way this burial mixes together kind of practical and functional alongside potentially kind of quite different elements of thinking about who metalworkers were and what their lives were like. So with that, it is Christina and I's pleasure to have shared this with you, and our huge thanks to the Wiltshire Museum for everything that they've done for us and this project, to our awesome colleagues at Leicester and Southampton, and to the Leverhulme Trust who funded this research. And we'd be really happy to take some of your questions.
Wow, that was fantastic. Really interesting. Although I've read the paper that you published in Antiquity, you were still telling us things that I hadn't spotted in the paper. Really interesting.
One of the things is that there are some extra nuggets of joy hidden in the supplemental information, which is some of what you've got this evening. So some of the stuff about where the gold object appears to have been used on similar gold sources, that's hidden in the supplemental information that you can download from the internet. But the limit on how long your article can be in Antiquity is incredibly strict. So there's even more gems.
Right. Sorry, I'm just trying to stop your. If you can stop your screen sharing, then we can people can see us properly, or something like that.
There we go. So that
I'm sure I should be able to do it, but. Can I have a crack first? There's one question in already. So if you take your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. You can click there and type your question in, which is, can you work gold when it's cold? Because I was very struck, you said there was no evidence of anything to heat gold. I'd always assumed that you would need to heat it to not obviously not melt it, but at least get it not at room temperature before you could work it effectively.
Christina, do you want to take that? All right, it's fine.
Yeah.
I think that's called passing the buck, isn't it?
So you can hammer gold, and that's how that sheet is being created. It's not kind of a pour it out into a really thin thing. It's hammer it out.
I thought it was a bit. I wonder if it might be a bit like when you're icing a Christmas cake. If you warm, or marzipan, if you warm it up in your hands first, then it's much easier to roll out.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one of the things where that kind of application of heat can do that. But the kind of understanding is that a lot of this is being hammered into the final shape rather than smelted. It's one of those really big differences between what's going on with kind of bronze at the same time, that really is something that you have to melt and pour into the right shape. Yeah. And this is something that you can hammer and spread and cut and decorate.
Even when it's cold.
Even when it's cold.
Yeah. Okay, right. We've got a whole bunch of questions coming in. So the first one, the working of gold is currently thought to have been considered magical. It's therefore thought that a shamanic costume was necessary to work gold, and what purpose might the animal whose skin and bone we used have had in the process, or might it have had a practical use such as protecting the face from heat?
What a lovely question. Yes, could well have had a practical use. I think kind of seeing these two things as necessarily practical and magical as separate is perhaps quite a modern thing to do, and not perhaps how things were in the Bronze Age. I'm a bit uncomfortable about the label shaman, because I'm not quite sure whether I think that's our imposition on this person. And I think instead thinking about these processes as being, if we think about science today, science is quite magical at times, the way materials can change into other stuff, the way we can understand the universe, and that kind of sense of being somebody who knew how to work these amazing new materials and how people might have thought about what you needed to do. When I am kind of teaching about bronze, one of the things I often say is that kind of to get it to smelt, you've got to hold it at a certain temperature inside the fire for a certain amount of time to get that effectively. And this is in a world where there isn't a watch and there isn't a thermometer. So how do you do those kind of magical processes? What is it that makes it work one time and not another? And I think thinking about kind of all the expertise that's necessary and how that might have been thought about is really important. And that kind of magical and religious, all of that kind of mixed together in these processes is really important, from my perspective anyway.
Just to add here, it's a point that Rachel made in the presentation, that we tend to divide, to see gold as a very different material to a stone, because this is what our modern understanding of materials tells us to do. But considering how they were making these gold objects at this stage, at the beginning, when they were working these metals, they were actually using a lot of the practices, a lot of the techniques they were already using in order to shape stone objects. And we need to remember that for them might not have been something so magical in that sense, but it was just another material that required hammering and smoothing in order to bring the color out. Because that's what was happening, for instance, with the polystone axes. Once you start polishing the stone, you bring out the texture and the color of the stone. So that's also something to remember, that a lot of the categories we have, like, we are used to our categories, but these are like modern understandings of materials. And it doesn't mean necessarily that people in the past saw materials in the same way.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. There's a question asking about the skeletons, which I'll answer, which is saying that are the skeletons still accessible? If so, could aDNA reveal their sex? Which is, if we got them in the museum, then they would have been included in a sort of previous set of analysis, but we don't have them in the museum. So unfortunately not. William Cullington didn't keep the human remains, so we don't have the human remains that go with the burials that you sort of talked about the objects from. Charlie has said, how pure was the gold? But actually your lovely triangle sort of showed that.
Yeah. So we don't really talk about purity in that sense when we talk about early Bronze Age gold. We're interested in the trace elements for what they tell us about where things came from, rather than that sense of purity. So I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but our kind of sense of thinking about what we've got is kind of we have gold, and then we also have traces of copper in there and other kind of small elements that are helping us understand origins rather than purity in that sense. I don't know if you remember the kind of purity figure in that sense, Christina, because it's not something that we think about really, is it?
Yeah.
It's embarrassing.
Okay.
I've never been asked that question before and I can't answer it.
Yeah. But I mean, it is all the data is in the paper, but I think it's about 5 to 10% copper. I mean, there are lots.
No,
there is a variation.
Well, your chart showed it as almost 100% pure gold. I think it's about 98 or 99% pure gold.
Yeah.
And I remember some of the audience will remember Chris Standish analysed one of the studs from the Bushbarrow dagger, and that was sort of 98, 99% pure gold. But as you say, he was focusing on the lead, and then just even within that, the isotopes in the lead. So, you know, focusing on the impurities. So, as you say, it's a bit of a very obvious question, but also one that, you know, we as archaeologists, we're less interested in because it's the impurities that are good for us.
Yes, impurities are key.
So, Sarah and Mike have said, what does EDS stand for? And can the gold on the tools be linked to the gold in the next door barrow? Well, except it's not next door because the shaman's burial is up on the top of the downs and the Upton Level golden barrow is right down by the river, down by the village.
So EDS is energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, a word I always struggle to say. Particularly, I've got the tail end of a cold. Spectroscopy is a tough one. It's basically a way of identifying the composition of objects at a kind of a micro scale. One of the really interesting things is that we are very, very lucky in that we have secured a loan of some objects from the Wiltshire Museum for some more study at Leicester in February and March, and we're going to be working on some of the gold objects from the Wiltshire Museum collection. And this is one of the things that Chris, who's going to be part of the project that we're doing, and Christina, who's going to be doing the analysis of, she's going to do wear analysis on these gold objects, and Chris is going to do some compositional work. And they're interested in looking at, is there any way we can piece some of these things together? Is it possible? One of the things that if Chris was here today, he would be saying, you can't say precisely which object the stone tools have worked. What you can say is that they have worked objects with a similar composition. So he prefers to talk about what he calls gold pools. And he doesn't mean that there's like literally a pool of gold. What he means is that you get particular clusters of impurities that are similar. And it suggests that they've come from some kind of, he won't use the word source because that's too precise, that they have this kind of similar origin, if you like, as a mineral. And whether we can pick out more of that and we can match up the objects is an open question, and something that we're really interested in. And that Chris in particular, who is absolutely brilliant at this kind of really brilliant analysis of gold, is hoping to turn our SEM, EDS and some other bits and pieces that we have at Leicester too in February and March. So fingers crossed, we'll be back with another paper.
A question from someone whose name you might recognise, Jennifer Wexler, who was one of the two curators of the World of Stonehenge exhibition at the British Museum. So she said, do you think that all battle axes were involved in gold or copper working, or would this be part of a ritualised working of these materials?
Christina?
Yeah, we know that battle axes have been used for different things. We actually studied an assemblage of battle axes from the British Museum, and there are different kinds of traces on them. So gold working or metal working is not always a common activity. It could be that, I mean, if you see this particular assemblage, it is interesting the way they have reused the battle axes, that they didn't just try to use whichever part of the battle axe or destroy it, kind of like they try to retain the original form as much as possible. I mean, even the one that is broken into two pieces, what they've done is that they retain the cutting edge, so that actually links to the original form of the battle axe, and one fragment has still traces of the perforation, while they're still visible, while the other one has been completely reworked. So it's almost like they're trying to keep some elements of the original form as much as possible, while they're actually also reusing these objects. So it is quite interesting, even like, they're not just using them in a kind of random way. So no, not all battle axes are metalworking tools. And I think that's why it is important to focus on the study of individual objects rather than create like a generic interpretation of these objects and take for granted that they are weapons, or they have always been used, at war, or to chop down wood or whatever. So the important thing that we want our study to highlight is it's important to focus on individual objects and study their histories and the traces on their surfaces, and then see it in this particular context and interpret them.
Yeah. Can I sort of develop on that slightly, which there's also Rosie has a question which sort of follows on from that, is you talked about the battle axe having the complete one having traces of being in contact with bone, and of course we use the word battle axe, but you also think, well, actually this would be great for slaughtering animals, and given the lack of evidence of violent death of caved-in skulls in the Bronze Age, and there's also the suggestion of the wear of some of the daggers that only one edge of the dagger is sharpened, which doesn't make any sense if it's a weapon. That is this around the slaughter of an animal before a feast? And some of you will have heard me talk about the Game of Thrones sort of, whoever kills the animal, gives the animal, is in charge of the feast, and that's how you get status.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So alongside, we've studied, Christina studied an assemblage of battle axes as this project, and then also a colleague of mine, Amber Roy, did her PhD on battle axes from Scotland and Northern Britain. And in her work, she shows that lots of them were used for bone, and she doesn't necessarily interpret that as violent smashing of human bones, but processing of bone to extract marrow, to ritually slaughter, are all possibilities based on the wear analysis. And there are some that have been used for things like breaking up roots as well, so they're really varied. I think statistically, and hers is the biggest study of wear on axes from Britain today, and the biggest proportion of them have bone wear on them, but there is equally a pile of other things in there too. And I think that kind of, the battle axe is a hefty object. Even the small ones have a real heft to them in terms of what they would have been like to whack. And that kind of slaughtering of animals, I think, is a really interesting direction to take it in.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that the fact that we have traces, so pretty much with the wear analysis, we can say that you have contact with bone, but then you cannot say whether it's human or animal bone. So that's very important to remember. So there's a limit to the analysis. But also other materials like wood, tilting the soil. I mean, these are all like traces that have been identified in other assemblages of battle axes. So we need to keep an open mind of what role these objects had in the past.
Yeah, and Rose's question touches on something you do mention in the paper, which is, she says, is it possible that stone axe, the battle axes may have been curated and passed from person to person from the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age?
So I think the battle axe is definitely a curated object in that sense. The flint axes are a little bit harder. They could be curated objects that have been passed down, in which case they've been passed down for an incredibly long time. If we were to think of them as being from the early Neolithic, then they're over 1,000 years old, well over 1,000 years old. And kind of that is a more difficult amount of time to think about an object being passed down for. And that, I think, certainly for Ollie and I think Christina too, actually, maybe these being found objects is another possibility that, people in the early Bronze Age do a lot of digging for barrows and digging of pits and coming into contact with spaces that have been previously occupied. Whether that's how these objects have appeared or whether they are handed down over generations is another possibility. For the battle axe, I definitely think these are kind of known objects that have been passed from hand to hand, and their history could be a couple of hundred years. It could be a bit shorter for them. They're known in that way. The flint axes are perhaps even more mind-bending to think about.
Just to add, when we looked at the surface of the axis, we didn't find any other traces. For instance, there's been another study in the Netherlands, Karsten Ventic, and he was looking at axes, and what he found was that some of the axes were actually covered. They were always placed in a leather bag or some cloth material, and they were, what you could see were traces from someone like covering the axe with the leather over and over again. And there he could make this argument about are these objects that are curated and looked after very carefully. But we don't have similar traces on the flint axis from the Upton Lovell. So we try to look at different to consider different interpretations, look at all the word traces, but there isn't something to suggest that kind of treatment. Obviously, we cannot disregard anything. Anything is possible, but yes, it's just at the moment we don't have something to support this interpretation.
Yeah. What struck me in the article was you talked about the possibility of them choosing the battle axes to transfer the stories of those objects to the gold objects that were being worked on.
Yeah, that's something that we're really interested in, is the way in which kind of those stories, or I mean, power as well, may have been transferred between these things. The process of kind of smoothing objects is really about moving smoothness from one thing to another, and kind of that transfer of why these particular rocks, why rocks that were once battle axes and rocks that were once flint axes were used in these ways, and what is it about them. And for us, that kind of idea of stories associated with them is really kind of appealing to think about how this happens. And just on that, I can see that Suzanne Keane has asked, are they always referred to as battle axes? I've always seen them simply axes. So there are two different kinds of axes here. There are flint axes, which are usually just called axes. And then in the early Bronze Age, a new form of stone axe emerges that gets called a battle axe. And the difference between a battle axe and an axe is that a battle axe has a hole perforated through the object. So if you think back to the slides, there are ones with a big hole drilled through them. The big hole makes it a battle axe, and that is the term that's used for them. And it kind of separates them chronologically as well. The battle axe dates to the early Bronze Age. The flint axe almost certainly dates to the Neolithic. So just wanted to clear that one up.
Okay, we've got questions from Frank and Amelia which cover similar areas, which is shamanism. This is Frank's question, but shamanism seems to be about transformation, drawing spiritual or material objects from other worlds, rivers and mountains and so on. So gold working shaman, could the two functions not be combined? Are they necessarily mutually exclusive?
Yeah, I think kind of that separation of the world of the kind of the world of what we might want to call magic or mystery or anything like that, and the kind of world of the functional, that's something that we do in the present, and it isn't a feature of all societies through all of time. And you're right that what a shaman does is transform, and what a metal worker and a crafter does is transform materials from different places, and that have come from different places too. And I think kind of thinking in those ways is a much more useful way to think about what that shaman label, if we're going to use it, might be doing. Is about that kind of transformation, not necessarily about somebody who might be taking some drugs and spiritually going to another world, although that isn't precluded from any of this, but thinking about the way in which those processes of transforming materials into each other and changing their form and how things appear might have been thought about at that time.
Sorry, someone's asked for a reference to your paper, so I was just trying to find that while there. And a couple of people have asked things that I know wasn't part of your research, but you know the obvious questions are: where do you think the gold came from, and do you know anything about where the stone used to make the tools comes from?
So stone is a bit easier to talk about. So there is some stone. One of the battle axes is Cornish. Another one of the battle axes is probably from the Winsill in Northumberland. It's the right rock type for that. And then there's a range of other lithologies in there that are less precisely kind of indicated, aren't they, Christina? Have I forgotten any of them where?
I mean, so pretty much there are two, actually, the two really reworked battle axe fragments. They're two, originally they would have been two different battle axes, and they both have a Cornish origin. So they actually, what you see is that they come from different parts of, let's say, Britain. I mean, that's what we assume at this stage, but there is a lot of variation where they're coming from. So you cover a large distance, even from just considering the battle axes. And the flint, I'm not sure, but I mean, again,
flint could be southern England is the most kind of obvious and nearest source if we go for the most parsimonious explanation. But obviously there are other flint sources in Britain too. So it's possible to get all of these materials in Britain, but they do represent movement, stuff from Northumberland as well as stuff from Cornwall, all ending up in Wiltshire. And then on the metal front, that's a much more contentious question. That Cornwall is probably the source for some things, if only Chris were here. But the kind of precise sourcing of gold in this is not straightforward. Everybody assumed for a very long time it was Ireland. There's now increasing evidence that there's Cornish stuff as well. So a wide variety of different sources there.
And just to say that obviously the battle axes that come from Cornwall and potentially the gold coming from Cornwall, that would have been an interesting link. We cannot say anything more, but that's just to highlight that could potentially be a very nice link.
And we may find out more later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's probably you've had a really interesting set of questions, and I think we'll probably call it a day there, unless anyone has a very last one. I put the link to your Antiquity paper. It's linked to from the news article that I put on our website, which is came out just before Christmas, so people can go there and see more of the objects and find and read the paper. So with that, I'd like to give a huge thanks to the both of you. It's been really interesting. I'm so glad you were able to come to the museum, because we had some interesting times over lockdown, didn't we? Sort of trying our best to make it all work. And there's going to be lots more information to come out about our collections from the various bits of research that are being done by you and your team, and of course by others that we're eagerly awaiting. So more to come. Really looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I hope that we're back with another exciting story. And as I said at the beginning, it's a tiny token of our massive gratitude for allowing us to work on your amazing collection.
Well, huge thanks. Okay, thank you everyone for listening, and see everyone again next time.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.